Shavua Tov, everyone. I'm recording ahead of time. I'm trying to change my name here. This is the Daf Bava Batra, Daf Yudchet, Daf 18, and it is the Daf for Shabbos or Motzaei Shabbat. I'm recording it ahead of time, which is why I'm recording it and why it's light outside. But today's Daf, hopefully you can hear clearly, is Daf Yudchet, so Daf 18. And we have started the second parak of Bava Batra, V'lo Yachbor. Remember, the fundamental rule in our Mishnah, the first thing that we discussed is that a person who's digging a ditch, and then we talked about other things, can't do that right next to somebody else's. You have to give some space because of the impact that it's going to have on his ditch or on his thing, on his field, whatever it might be. We then had a machloket in the beginning of the Gemara yesterday, or yesterday's daf, between Abaya and Rava. When the Mishnah says you can't dig a ditch within 3 tfachim of somebody else's ditch, Abaya said, if the person has nothing else next to you, right? They didn't dig a bar, and your field goes up to their field, you can dig right up to the edge of the field. Because the halacha of the Mishnah is that you can't dig within 3 tfachim, but if there's no bar there, you can dig right up to the edge of your field. It's a theoretical thing. You don't have to worry about it. Rava said, no, the ruling is always there. We had a few versions of Rava and Abaya, but that you would have to be marchik from the edge of your field 3 tfachim, even if there was no bar on the other side, because when that person came to dig their bar, they would find that they can't dig it at the edge of their field because of your thing. So therefore, you have to distance it even if it doesn't exist yet. And then we started yesterday to bring proofs from our Mishnah and other places about Abaya and Rava's argument. Is this a practical or a theoretical thing? So I'm going to start from the bottom line of Daf Yud Zayin Amud Bet. Hopefully that's where we got up to. Tashma. Come and learn from our Mishnah whether you can prove Abaya or Rava is correct. So what does the Mishnah say? Now, we're quoting our Mishnah. Marchikin, you have to distance your thing. We'll see what the thing is in a second. Marchikin et gefet, which remembers the crushed up parts of the dates and the figs that are used, the leftover, basically, the compost. Veta zevel in your garbage. Veta melach. Zevel is like manure, it's not garbage. Veta melech and salt. Veta seed and plaster. Veta slaim and your stones. All of this garbage, basically, you have to distance it. You can't put it within 3 tvachim of the wall of your friend. Osad bisin. Or you can plaster over the wall, or it might be or you can plaster over the wall. But otherwise, we're afraid these are going to damage the wall. But this seems to support Abaya because it needs to sound like you can't put it within 3 tvachim of a wall. Let's say there's no wall there, but the guy might build a wall later. That doesn't seem to be a problem. Says the Gemara, time at the Ika top of Yud Chedam and Alf. The reason that it's a problem is because there's a wall there, and you're not allowed to put it within 3 tvachim of the wall, implying haleka kotel somech. The wall wasn't there. You can put it right up to the edge of your property, which goes against Rava. Answers Rava lo, it's not correct, or answers the Gemara for Rava. Hileka kotel nami lo samach. Even if there was no wall there, you're not allowed to put your garbage up against the edge of your field. So why did the Mishnah say, don't put it up against his wall? Elamai kamash malan. The chiddush of the Mishnah is, ha kamash malan dahani kashu lekotel. That the reason we don't want you putting these things down is that they will weaken the wall. They're moist, and they're, I guess, have heat with them, and they're going to cause there to be damage in the wall. So now says Rava, even if there's no wall, since a person's allowed to put up a wall at the edge of their field, right at the edge of their property, you can't put these kind of garbage next to the wall. And it would imply even other things that cause the same kind of problem. Right, Tashma. So let's bring a proof from the next case of the Mishnah, right? We're 5 lines from the top of Yud Chet Amud Aleph. What do the next lines of the Mishnah say? Marchikin et hazra'im, you have to distance your seeds. Et machresha is the plow. Et meiraglayim, and urine, min hakotel shlosha tvachim. These things also you can't do them right up against the wall. They have to be 3 tvachim away. Again, it's the same proof for Abaya against Rava. Implies it that you can't put them up against a wall. Time adika kotel. Haleka kotel, but if there was no wall, then it seems like Abaya, you can put these up, samich, you can put them right up against the edge of your property, even though the person then can't build a wall. Answers the Gemara, the same answer, lo. The same thing is true. Hileka kotel nami lo samich, that you cannot put these up there even if there's no wall. So then why did the Mishnah say don't put it up against a wall? Say don't put it up against his property. The same chiddush, hakamash malan, maikamash malan, hakamash malan, the mitunta literally means matun, is something that's moist, that's wet. is kasher lekotel. That the reason that these things are not supposed to be put up against the wall is that they cause the urine, and the seeds also have moisture. They cause dampness, they cause wetness, and that causes damage in the wall. And that's the chiddush. It's not because there is a wall, it's because when there will be a wall, according to Rava, or if there is a wall, according to Abaya, these will cause damage to the wall, and you have to put it 3 tfachim away. Remember, 3 tfachim is around, what do we say, around 9 to 11 inches, or the 2 shiurim of 3 tfachim, half an amma. Tashma. Okay, the next case of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that harechayim, right? If you're putting a rechayim, a grinder, right, a millstone, then remember there's the part that goes on the bottom. There's a part that's on the top, and if you recall, the part on the top is smaller than the part on the bottom. So shlosha min hashechev, the wall has to be, or you have to put it 3 tfachim from the shechev, which is the bottom part, which expands a little. Shehin arba min harechev, which is 4 tfachim away from the top part, which goes in a tefach. But again, the same thing. It says marchikim min hakotel. Time adiga kotel. The whole problem is that there's a wall. Haleka kotel, you'd be sambich. Again, question on Rava. You could put it up right against the wall, which is what Abaya said. Lo, Rava would say to you that's not the truth. The Mishnah is saying kileka kotel nami lo samich. Even if there's no wall, you also can't put it up next to it. The elamai kamash malan. So then what is the chiddush of the Mishnah saying, don't put it up against a wall? And again, hakamash malan, that the whole point is that we're afraid you shouldn't put this there because it's going to damage the wall. And according to Rava, even if there is no wall, it's going to damage a future wall. That the chiddush is the tirya kasher lekota. The tirya means vibrating, the movement of these objects, right? Remember, you have a grinder, as everyone knows, you're causing a lot of vibration every time you roll this over the thing. That itself is bad for a wall if it's close to a wall. And so you're not allowed to put it within 3 tfachim of the edge of your property, according to Rava, because it will damage any future wall. According to Abaya, it's only if there is a wall there. Otherwise, you can put it up to the edge. But that's Rava's explanation. Okay, Tashma, let's keep going, right? The Mishnah continued and said, we are around, 15 lines from the top, middle of the line. Tashma, come and learn from the next section in the Mishnah. It says, at a tanur, if you have an oven, or an oven causes a lot of heat, right? Damage if it's next to the wall. It has to be shlosha, 3 tfachim away from the kalya, which I don't know how you translated yesterday, but most translate as the base of the oven. Shein arba min hasafa, which is 4 from the upper rim of the oven, which is one way to read it, but that would mean that the base is wider and the rim goes in, right? So it's 4 tfachim away from the edge of the top and 3 from the bottom. Tosfos had it almost the opposite, that the oven balloons out. But either way, you have to keep a distance from your oven to the wall. Again, time adika kotel. Question on Rava, it implies it's only because there's a wall, and we don't want your thing to be close to the wall. Haleka kotel samich. If there was no wall, you'd be allowed to put the oven up right against the edge of your property. Lo, Rava again would say that's not what it means. It's saying kileka kotel nami lo samich. Even if there's no wall in Ruvain's property, Shimon cannot put an oven up against his boundary. Elamai kamashmalan. So why do we mention a wall? Kamashmalan, again, that havla, that heat, hevel means the heat of the oven, is kashet lakotel. It's negative, it's bad, and will damage a wall. And so that's why we don't allow you to put it there according to Rava. The Mishnah, again, is giving you a reason. And the reason, and the question is, why do we really care so much about the reason? We could have asked us about all these 4 questions. So it might be because, what about other things, right? If you're not allowed to build an oven, can you put fireworks next to your wall? Can you do you learn from here about other things? And then the other question I would say is that there is a possibility that there are circumstances where you are allowed to put it up there in some situations. We'll discuss some of those later today. So Tashma, okay, let's try to prove we're past our Mishnah. We're now first word on the line. Tashma, again, it's, 20 or so lines, not quite halfway down. What about, there's a Mishnah later. This is a Mishnah we're going to have in a couple days, again on Daf Chaf, I believe. It's the Gimel, Chaf Amabet. The Mishnah later says that lo yiftach, a person should not open. I have a great Gemara in front of me. Lo yiftach Adam chanut shel nachtomim v'shel tzavaim tachat otzro shel chaveiro. What does that mean? let's say a person, you live in a house, right? Two-story house. You own the studio, the bottom floor. Someone lives above you. If a person has an otsar is a storage house where you put a lot of wine, right? Or other food too, but let's just say wine. You shouldn't open up a bakery, nachtom is a bakery, or a tzavaim, which is a dye shop. These are very, bakery has a lot of heat that goes up. The dye smells and has fumes. You can't put that underneath your friend's otsar because the fumes are gonna go up or the heat's gonna go up and ruin the wine or ruin the produce. Velo refet bakar. You also can't put your cattle. You can't say, I'll put my cows there and they'll do what they do their business. The smell and the avira is going to be bad for his thing. Okay. Now the problem here is that this implies that you can't do that if the person already has an otsar on top of you, right? Which is what Abaya said. But according to Rava, even if they don't have an otsar, in theory, you shouldn't be allowed to do it anyways, because what if he wants to place an otsar? Right? So remember, Rava worried about what would happen if he wanted to do this thing. The Mishnah later implies it's only a problem if it already exists. Says the Gemara, Taima, the reason it's prohibited is the Ika Otsar. It's because your neighbor above you, already has a storage house there for his food. Haleka Otsar, but if he didn't, Avid. Why? According to Rava, you can't do it even for a future problem. Must be Rava's wrong. Says the Gemara, don't ask questions from the next Mishnah, because that Mishnah is not referring to a field. It's referring to a dira, shani. It's referring to a residence, right? In a residence, the rules are very different, because in a residence, dekanami, that makes sense. The Tani Allah, because the Mishnah continues to say, Im haita refet bakar kodemet lo'otzar mutar. If the refet bakar was there, if you made your space for your cattle there, before he put the otsar, then it's mutar. So now, remember, our Mishnah didn't say anything about that, right? Our Mishnah didn't say which one happens first, which one happens later. Clearly, the rules for a house are different, because in a house, people are expected to use their house for whatever they want, right? Unlike a field, where there's greater limitation on how you use your field or where you put your thing. In a house, there are different considerations, and therefore, it might be true, says Rava, that in a house, you're only not allowed to use your space for your bakery or your dyeing shop or your cattle if someone else living above you already turned it into an otsar. But if they didn't, we don't stop you from using your house for things that are necessary for your daily living. So, okay, that's not a proof. So Tashma, let's look at a Mishnah that's even later. This Mishnah is Daf Chaf Vav, in a week, right? Says the Mishnah, more than a week. Lo yita adam ilan samuch l'sadeh. You have a field next to somebody else's field. You can't plant a tree right next to their field, right? Ella in Cain hirchik mimenu arba amot, unless you put your tree more than 4 amot away from his field, right? And why is that? But Tani Allah, so we learned in the Gemara later. Again, remember we had earlier that you can't have a tree 25 amot. We'll get into why this is a little bit different from a bor. Remember, a tree, the roots would go into it. But this is just saying you can't plant your tree within 4 amot of somebody else's field. V'tani Allah, we learned about that. That is arba amot sha'amru kedei sha'avodat hakerem. The reason 4 amot are there so that someone can work the field. Meaning, if you have trees, you have to be able to get around them with animals and to plow and to clean and to prepare the land. So if your tree is right up next to the field, then there's no way you'll be able to work the land around it. And so you have to have your tree more than 4 amot away from the edge of your field. Now, says the Gemara, the implication there is the only reason you can't plant your tree up against the edge of your field is taima mishum kidei avodat hakerem. It's so that the person can work their vineyard, right? So they have basically 4 amot on their around their property to do that avodah, to travel. But implying halav mishum kidei avodat hakerem, if they didn't need it, let's say they didn't have a vineyard, it was a blank field, then you would be samich. You'd be allowed to put your tree right up next to the field. Why? Right? They don't have a vineyard. They don't need that extra space. Why are you allowed to put your tree there? Afagav deika shrashim dekamaski. But aren't there going to be roots that are going to cause damage to their field? Right? If let's say you want to plant something and there's a tree right next to you, the tree's roots are going to limit the yield from your field. So it seems to imply that since you don't have anything planted on your field yet, the other person can plant their tree right up to the edge, assuming that there's not a problem of an avodat kerem. But why is that so? According to Rava, that shouldn't be the case. Answers the Gemara, you're right. That doesn't make any sense according to Rava, but it's a specific case. And the case here is Hacha b'mayaskinan demafsik tsunma. It's a case where there's a hefsik, there's a separation of tsunma, which means like rocks. So you have basically a rocky field where even if you plant your tree, the roots of the tree can't move over, right? The fence basically goes underground. And that's not a fence, but it's rocks. So it's a rocky field. You didn't clear the rocks. And so planting on one edge, of course, this was very common, right? When they had very rocky fields, you clear the rock from an area, you leave it in the border between the two fields. And so the roots of the tree can't go underground, basically. You have an underground fence, which are your rocks. So therefore, it wouldn't be a problem to have a tree next to the field. It won't cause any damage. The problem is that if I have a vineyard there, I have to drive around my vineyard. And I need 4 amot to do that. So if your tree is within 4 amot, it's going to cause interruption in my activity. So that's the problem. It says the Gemara, Dekanami. In fact, it makes sense that this is talking about a situation where there's not a problem of the roots because there are rocks there. Diktani, because the Mishnah continues there later and says, Hayag gader beintayim, right? If let's say you have a fence there between the two fields, then you're allowed to put your tree up to the fence. You can plant your tree right up to the fence on each side. Now, because you're not going to drive your tractor around it because there's a fence. But if there's a problem of roots, how could you plant your tree right up next to somebody else's tree? The roots are going to get entwined. It's going to cause it not to grow, right? And so therefore, some take out the words dekonamis, you see them in parentheses, but we're going to read it the way it is in the Gemara without parentheses, without the parentheses. So it says that each one can put a fence up to it, implying that there must be a underground fence. There must be rocks that are contributing to prevent the roots of the tree causing a problem. And that must be the case. Says Gemara, slow down. If that's the case, Yihachi im seifa. But what about the case that continues the Mishnah later, right? Where am I? By the tet, at least in my thing, there's a tet. Yihachi im seifa. What about the end part of the Mishnah? It says, now we're quoting the Mishnah later, Hayu sharashav yotzim betoch shel chavero. If the roots of the tree are going out of the field into your friend's field, right? Meaning you plant a tree and the roots of the tree are coming out into the field of your friend, then ma'amik lehen shloshat tfachim, you have to cut them or deepen them, meaning remove them for up to 3 tvachim deep. So you have to clear the top 3 tvachim of soil, which again is like 9 inches, 10 inches, maybe 11. Kedei shlo yakev hamachresha. So when the plow comes over them, the plow doesn't get caught on them, right? The plow doesn't go down 5 feet, but it goes down 3 tvachim, which again is around 9 to 11 inches. You have to clear out those roots. Now, that's an interesting halacha. We're going to discuss later on who has to pay for it, what you have to do. But it doesn't make any sense according to your pshat of the Mishnah, because you explained that the Mishnah was referring to where there are rocks preventing the tree's roots from going over into the other field. But if there's rocks preventing it from going over the other field, then what do you mean if the roots are there? The roots can't be there, right? If there's an underground fence of rocks, basically, my ba'uhatam, how the roots get to the other field, right? So there shouldn't be any roots there. So how could you explain that the Mishnah is referring to when there's no problem of roots because there's a fence, or again, I keep using the word fence, but it means underground rocks. There can't be, then why does it continue and say if there's roots, you get rid of them? Answers the Gemara Hachikamer. Now, this is what the Mishnah means later on. The in lav tsunma, if you didn't have this rocky separation of a fence, basically between the two fields, and therefore, if my tree is next to your field, the roots can go to your field. And continues the Mishnah, Vahayu sharashav yotzim letoch shel chavero, and the roots of the tree do go into the field of the friend, then you have to get rid of those roots. Ma'amik shloshat tfachim, you have to get rid of the roots for 3 tfachim from the top of the soil, meaning 9 or 11 inches down. Kedei shlo ya'akev hamachresha, so that when you pull a plow over it, the plow doesn't break on the roots, right? So you have to clear it enough that you can plow the land. Okay, Tashma, we are around 14 lines from the bottom, I'm going to guess, middle of the line. What about the following case? Tashma, remember we learned This is I quoted this from before, but this is actually a Mishnah much later, not much later, but later in the parak as well, and that is the halacha of marchikin et ilan min habor esrim v'chamesh amma. That if you have a tree that's near a well, a bar we talked about was not a well, it's really a cistern, right? A underground container for water, right? You can't have a tree within 25 amot of that because, of course, the tree is going to have roots. Roots of the tree can go very far, 25 amot, remember, it's like 40 feet. And they'll go into the wall of the well and they'll make it leak, right? And a leaky well, a leaky cistern is not very helpful. So the Mishnah says later that your machikinata ilan min habar, you have to distance a tree from a bar 25 amot. Now, the implication again of the Mishnah is like Abaya, that if there's a bar, you have to make your tree 25 amot away. Taima deika bar. But if there's no bar, then you can plant your tree. Let's say you're 10 amot away from your friend's field. And if he later on wants to build a bar, he can't because it's within 25 amot, then that's his problem. But according to Rava, it's not the case. You can't do your thing if in the future it's going to cause damage. Haleka bar, but if the Mishnah seems to imply that if there is no bar already there in your neighbor's field, samich, you can put your tree closer than 25 amot to his property. It says we're low. It's not true. Rava would say, hileka bar nami lo samich, that even if there's no existing cistern, if I have a field next to somebody else and there's a chance he's going to dig a cistern there, I cannot plant a big tree within 25 amot of the border. What's the chiddush of the Mishnah? The chiddush of the Mishnah, Kamash 1, the Mishnah said, is telling you the same thing as we said before, that ad esrim mechamesh amma, that up to 25 amot, again, a very large distance, some are like 40 feet, azli shrashim umaski the bar, that the roots of a tree, again, has to be a big tree, can go and damage a bar. So the chiddush of the Mishnah has to be that it's not a chiddush, but it is a chiddush. But the point of the Mishnah is that a tree can damage a bar up to 25 feet away, and that's what 25 amot away, and that's why we said a case of a bar. But it would be true even if there was no bar. Says the Gemara, if that's true, then the rest of the Mishnah doesn't make any sense because the next words in the Mishnah are 10 lines or so from the bottom. Ema seifa. Look at the end of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "V'im ilan kodem," if the tree came first, then lo yikotz. Then if the person then builds a bar within 25 amot, because you put the tree, say 10 amot away from your border, you don't have to cut it down. Not understand. Rava just said you can't ever put a tree within 25 amot of the quarter, of the edge of your boundary. So how would you ever have a situation where there's a tree there first before the bar? V'ida lo samich, if you're not allowed to put it next to the edge of your boundary, heichi mishkachetla. How would there ever be a case where there's a tree that came first, and then you did a bar, and the Mishnah is saying you don't have to cut down the tree? Says you're right. Rava said that you can never go ahead and do it, but there's a big loophole. And the Kedamar of Papa's, Rav Papa is going to say later on today, and we'll have it tomorrow as well, bilokeach, in a case where you buy a field and there's already a tree there, right? Let's say someone owns, 100 feet of a field, and he plants a tree smack in the middle of his field. And then he sells 50 feet or 40 feet to somebody else. So now the person who bought that field bought a field that's 10 feet away from a tree. In that situation, that's the condition of the sale, right? You knew the tree was there basically when you bought it. And there, I don't have to cut down my tree because I sold you a field that's a few feet away, right? So in a case of lokeach, a case where you purchase a field that already has a tree inside of it, then you can't come and claim that you've got to cut it down. And so that's what the case must be, right? Hachanami bil-lokeach. The second part of the Mishnah is referring to a case of lokeach, where if the tree was there, and then I sold basically the field next to it, that's less than 25 amot away, the person who bought it knew about the tree, they knew what the deal was. And if they then dig a bar, I don't have to get rid of my tree because of his bar. Okay, Tashma. Let's continue from the next case, right? The next case is another Mishnah, again later in this parak. It says, Marchikin et mishra min hayeret. This is a very interesting halacha, that you have to distance your mishra. Mishra is the soaking of, they would take, flax and they would soak it to get it softer, I guess, for a very, very long time. But it causes, I guess, problems with the ground because some of it leaks down. You have to distance that from yerek, from vegetables that are growing We'll see how much in a minute, right? So you have to make that go far away. And ata kreshim min habitzalim, you have to distance your kreshim. Kreshim are leeks. We usually translate from somebody else's onions, right? Batzal. So let's say you're growing leeks next to kreshim. You have to make a distance between the two of them. And we're gonna see later, because it ruins the taste of them. So that if you plant these two together, the onions are not as strong. I guess they get some taste from the leek, and that moderates them. But you have to make a distance. Veta chardal min hadvorim, and you can't plant mustard seeds next to bees where there's beehives, because we're going to discuss this as well. It's not clear. The Gemara is going to talk later about why, but let's just say the bees go and they taste the honey. They taste the chardal, and their honey doesn't taste good. It's not what the Gemara is going to say, but that's one possible reason. But all of these things, you have to worry about keeping a distance between the two. But again, it implies, like Abaya, that it's a practical question, not a theoretical question, right? Taima, the reason you can't put your mishra, let's say your flax soak in the field is the ika yerek, because there exists a vegetable next to it. Haleka yerek samach. But if it wasn't there, you don't have to worry about theoreticals, which is exactly what Abaya said. Answers the Gemara, no, Rava would tell you again, there's like he did all day today, hileka yerek nami lo samach. That even if there's no vegetable, you can't put your flax soak next to the edge of your field where your friend might plant a vegetable. What's the chiddush? Hakamash milan dani kashil hadadi. The chiddush is that these are bad for each other. I guess you probably didn't know earlier today that mustards and bees don't go along with each other. Now, the Mishnah taught you that you can't put mustard seeds next to a place where there might be bees. Iachi says, what about the end of the Mishnah? Rabbi Yossi mater b'chardal. Rabbi Yossi says, no, you can plant your mustard seed even next to somebody else's bees. Mipnei shiachol lomar, because the person who's planting the mustard could say, instead of you coming to me, neighbor, and saying, get your mustard seeds away from my bees, why don't you move your bees? Right? You don't want my chardal next to your bees. I don't want your bees next to my chardal. Right? Why don't I want your bees? Because your bees are going to come and eat my, I'm not clear what lugle means, but let's just say the stems or something of my chardalim. So meaning it goes both ways. Rabbi Yossi says that in the last case of chardal, the same way that the beekeeper says, "Oh, your chardalim are ruining for my bees," I say your bees are ruining my mustard. Now turn the page. Daf Yod Chet Amud Bet. Now idelo samich. If we're talking about a case which is Rava's explanation that this is theoretical, this is not practical, then how could Rabbi Yossi be talking about a case where I say your bees are damaging my chardal, right? How did it even happen that you're not, according to Rava, you're never allowed to have chardalim near the edge of your field because of bees. So then there's no circumstance in which you'll be permitted to plant it. So how could you go to the person and say, why are you putting your bees here? My chardalim are already here. You're never allowed to have your chardalim next to the edge of a field. Rav Papa said, Rav Papa, the same answer that we said earlier, which we were quoting it from here. It's bilokeach. It's talking about a case where you purchased a field. The other person who you maybe bought it from, but it doesn't have to be, already had a chardal plant, let's say, growing at the edge of the field, right? And in that case, you come around and you say, wait a second, I want you to get rid of your chardal because my bees, I could say to you, I want you to get rid of your bees because of my chardal. But that's where Rava would say you're allowed to have planted it there because when you planted it, it wasn't next to the edge of the field, okay? Ask the Gemara, Ibelokeach, but I don't get it. If it's talking about a case where you purchased it, so my time de Rabbanan. So why would the Rabbanan say that you have to get rid of your object, right? Let's say you have leeks and he then has onions next to it, that you have to get rid of your leeks because they're going to ruin his onions. Your leeks were there first, according to the way we're explaining it. And then he bought the field and planted onions. It's not your problem. The Odin further, my time de Rabbi Yossi, right? Why would Rabbi Yossi himself, who says that it's talking about a case where you can argue and say the bees and the chardal, afilo mishrav is yarkanami. Why would it just be in the case of the bees, even in the other cases of mishra, remember, that's the soaked flax, and yarka and vegetables should also be the same question, right? Which is that I had my mishra there first. I sold the field. You then planted your vegetables. And now you're upset that the vegetables are being ruined. That's not my problem. You bought the field that way. Amar Ravina, says Ravina, you're right. This is, in fact, what we really explain here is Kasavi Rabbanan. The Rabbanan have the opinion that it's al hamazik laharchik et atzmo, that it's up to the one who's causing damage. That since it's the soaked field of flax that causes the damage to the vegetables, since it's the leeks that cause damage to the batzal and the mustard that causes damage to the bees, even if when you planted it, you were allowed to plant it, the fact that it's causing damage now requires the mazik to get it, to remove it, to make it go far away and to move this thing. Says, well, if that's what the Rabbanan say, so what does Rabbi Yossi say? Rabbi Yossi, remember, comes and argues, right? Mechlal de Rabbi Yossi Savar, what you're saying, that Rabbi Yossi holds that it's al hanizak, it's the one who's damaged, meaning the beekeeper in this case, that it's his responsibility to step away from his bees getting damaged from the flax. But if that's true, nizak, if it's the one being damaged who's got to separate himself or herself from the damaging thing, then afilu mishra v'yarkanami. So then the same question would be true about the soak and the vegetables, right? Where the damaging one is the one with the soaked flax. But as long as you started off properly, if it's the one who's being damaged, the one who planted the vegetables who's got to distance it, why doesn't that person have to remove his vegetables? Why does the mission, again, we don't really have an answer for why there would be a difference between the case of the bees and the other two cases of the soaked flax or the what's it called? Not the onions, but the other thing, the leeks that were separated. Ella, says the Gemara today, we are, where am I up to? Ella is the last of the narrow lines on this very short daf of Yurchet Amud Bet. Ella, says the Gemara, you're right. Of course, La'olam, everyone agrees, and this is obvious, that Rabbi Yossi Nami al Hamazik, spherely. That the Rabbi Yossi agrees that when a person's causing damage to somebody else, you don't say, why don't you go somewhere else? If I came and caused damage to you, it's my responsibility as the damager, the mazik, to separate the damage. The Hachi Kamal Rabbi Yossi the Rabbanan. Rabbi Yossi is saying to the Rabbanan, look, I understand that Tenach, I get the case, that Mishra v'Yarka, right? I agree with you that in a case where you have a soaked flax, which is stinky, right? And you use vegetables next to it, the vegetables are not causing problems with the flax. The flax is causing problems with the vegetables. There's clearly an aggressor, we'll call it, right? Or an offending thing and the other thing, right? And the same is true about the leeks and the onions. The onions don't cause problems for the leeks cause problems for the onions. So I understand that in that case, honey maski, the flax causes damage, honey, these damage these, honey lo maski honey, but the vegetables are not causing any problems. But, says Rabbi Yossi, when you come to the case of the bees and the chardal, it's not so simple. El chardal dvorim, when you come to the case of the mustard seeds and the bees, tervayo masko hadadi, each one causes damage to the other. The bees damage the chardalim, maybe because they eat them and they don't let them grow properly. The chardalim damage the bees. Again, I didn't tell exactly why, but either because the bees die or because the honey tastes bad or something like that. And therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, in that case, it's not so clear who has to move, right? Because each one causes damage to the other. So it should be the one who was there first, gets to keep it. The Rabbanan say, no, it's not true. What damage are bees doing? Bees are good for plants, right? Dvarim l'chardal lo maskile. Bees don't damage chardal, onions. Again, I'm not very qualified to really comment on any of this, but that's our Gemara. That what damage are the bees going to cause to the onion, to the chardal, to the mustard plants? Ibe binta, if you're worried about binta, which Tosfos at least explains means the seeds of it, meaning the inside of the mustard plant, lo mishkachadle. The bees never get inside. It's covered. It's sealed, right? I guess it's covered. Maybe it means because the mustard is covered with a hard shell. Ibit tarfa, if you're talking about the leaves, right, the part of that's exposed, what's the problem if the bees eat that? Hadr pari, it's going to grow again, meaning it'll regrow if it comes off. And so Therefore, there is, according to the Rabbanan, there is no damage from bees on mustard plants, and therefore it's only a one-way problem. It's that mustard plants cause damage to the bees, and since mustard plants cause damage to the bees, it's on the responsibility of the owner of the mustard plant to move their plant, right? According to, even if the case is, as we're saying, that it was planted there first, and then you sold the field. But when you cause damage, you have to move it, okay? Ask the Gemara, "V'savar Rabbi Yossi ala mazik l'archiket atzmo." But is it true, right, that Rabbi Yossi holds what the Chachamim hold, that when you're mazik, you're the one who has to separate, if you're causing damage, you have to distance your thing. That's not, but we learned in the Mishnah later, when we talked about this tree, remember we said you can't plant a tree within 25 amot to the edge of the field. But we said if the tree was there first, and then the bore was dug, then the tree doesn't have to be moved. And there, Rabbi Yossi comments, what's not, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Afal pi sha'abor kodemet li'ilan, even if the bore came first, right, meaning a person dug a bore, a cistern, a neighbor then dug a tree, planted a tree, and the tree came second. So there, says Rabbi Yossi, lo yakotz, you don't have to cut down your tree. The Chachamim said if it's within 25 amot, you got to cut it down. Says Rabbi Yossi, you don't have to cut it down. It's none of your business. You dig your cistern in your property. I'm planting my tree on my property. I don't have to worry about what the roots are going to do. So Rabbi Yossi clearly doesn't hold anything. We know it's going to cause damage. Rabbi Yossi claims you don't have to worry about it. Ella says, Gemara, you're right. Rabbi Yossi has this opinion, which we're going to see throughout this whole parak, that, I don't really have to worry about what my property is going to do to you. Lola Rabbi Yossi holds, if you've got a problem on Nizak Sphirale, you are the Nizak, you move your bar. I plant a tree, I'm allowed to plant a tree. It's your mistake. You put a cistern at the edge of your field. You should have known that I could come one day and plant a tree. It's not my problem. It's in my property. So why is Rabbi Yossi saying, what about the bees? You got to move the bees. They're not a problem. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yossi is saying, he's saying, I don't agree with any of this. I don't think there's any problem. I can have my bees. I can have my chardal next to your bees. It's not my problem. You get rid of your bees. I'm going to keep my chardal. But he's saying, according to you, Chachamim, your bee example doesn't make any sense. Because look, lididi, according to me, we are 4 lines from the bottom. I don't think there's any problem. Ala nizak l'archiket atzmo, it's the one who's being damaged, who doesn't want to, he says, you're ruining the taste of my honey, you're ruining the taste of my vegetables. I could say to you, well, move your honey, move your vegetables, right? And afilo mishra v'yarka lo bayrachoki. I don't even have to get rid of my soaked flax if it's next to your vegetables, because you move your vegetables. Ella lididchu, according to you, chachamim, who say, no, amritu ala mazik, that it's the damager has to move their thing. Says Rabbi Yossi, I understand your opinion about the case of Mishra v'Yarka, where it's clearly a one-direction damage. The honey, mazki honey. The Mishra, the soaked flax, is what's damaging the vegetables. But the vegetables are not damaging the flax. The honey, lo mazki honey. So therefore, I understand the responsibilities on the damager, the mazik. Aval, the case of chardal udvorim, but the case of mustard seeds that are growing and bees, tervayo mazki adadi. My opinion is that they both damage each other, and therefore it's not so equivocal who's the aggressor and who's the aggrieved in this case. And that's where the Rabbanan say, no, we disagree, that devorim the chardal do mazkile, that bees do not cause damage to mustard plants, right? They're beneficial maybe. Because if you're talking about the inside, the seed that will regrow, lo mishkachatli, the bees don't go in there. They can't. This is how we sort of understand the Gemara. They can't get into that space, right? Because either it's hard or it's sort of deep inside. And so therefore, bees do not cause problem on the inside. And if you're worried that they're going to alight on the leaves or eat the leaves, other pari, it's going to grow back again. And so therefore, there is no concern, according to the Chachamim, for the bees causing damage to the mustard. The mustard is causing damage to the bees, and therefore say the Chachamim, the owner of the mustard plant has to move his plant. Says Rabbi Yossi, it's not true ever. I can plant a mustard seed in my plant in my yard. You got to move your bees. And so that is what we're up to at the 2 dots at the top of your Tet Amid Aleph. Tomorrow, I think we're talking now about Sunday morning, we will continue with Daf Yud Tet in the next case of the Mishnah, which is the case of Nivrechet HaKofsim, the washing, and we'll get to tomorrow exactly what the damage could be with that and why you have to separate it from the wall. So hopefully this recording was all caught and everyone will see it. And I look forward to learning in person with everyone on Sunday. Shavua Tov.